All right, here we are. We're going to try this again. Another lecture concerning the Middle Ages, covering the material between chapters 8 and 11. So here we go. Last class, or the last time that we had a lecture in class, we were discussing the political unification of European countries and kingdoms. We'd kind of run through England, and now we're going to move on and talk about what's going on with France. Okay. Now, going back to France, if you'll remember when we discussed Charlemagne and how his son, Louis the Pious, was an ineffective ruler, and Charlemagne's empire was divided amongst his grandsons, particularly Charles the Bald, Louis the German, and Lothair. Well, Charles the Bald inherited the western portion of the empire, and that would be referred to as West Francia. Okay, West Francia. So France originated as West Francia. That was the old western half of the Carolingian Empire, and he gained that as a result of the Treaty of Verdun in 843. So he was part of the Carolingian dynasty, and a branch of that dynasty would continue to rule West Francia until 987, when an individual by the name of Hugh Capet, he's not really on here, but it talks about his dynasty, the Capetian dynasty. His name was Hugh Capet, and that's Hugh, just like you'd expect Hugh to be. And then Capet is just Capet. All right, so he would establish a dynasty known as the Capetian dynasty. Well, this again started in 987 when he was elected king and established his dynasty. The territory would remain known as Francia, and its ruler would be called the King of the Franks. So he's not really the King of France, he's the King of the Franks. And that's the title that will be passed on from king to king in France until 1190, when Philip II begins to call himself the King of France. So France is going to be continued to be ruled by the Capetian dynasty and their related lines, later on the Valois and the Bourbon dynasties, until the monarchy eventually is overthrown during the French Revolution all the way in 1792. So the Capetian dynasty will be in charge of France in some form or another. They may take on the name Valois or Bourbon, but until 1792, this dynasty will pretty much control France. Now, initially, they didn't have much power. All right. It was pretty limited in what they actually controlled. So, France in the Middle Ages, like most European kingdoms, was decentralized. It was a feudal monarchy. Um, in Brittany and Catalonia, which is now part of Spain, the authority of the French king was barely felt. Lorraine and Provence were states of the Holy Roman Empire, not yet even part of France. Initially, West Frankish kings were elected by powerful nobles and clergy, but the regular coronation of the eldest son of the reigning king during his father's lifetime established this principle of male primogeniture, when everything passes to the firstborn son. And it kind of became codified in French law. Now, what happens in the late Middle Ages is the King of England, they lay claim to the French throne. And so this is going to lead to a series of conflicts that we'll call the Hundred Years' War. But that's virtually the last thing that we'll talk about in Chapter 11. We're not quite there yet. But just know that there's this rivalry amongst the French and the English kings over territory in France. And it will culminate in this great war known as the Hundred Years' War that'll last from 1337 until 1453. But during the later years of Charlemagne's rule, the Vikings had made inroads into the kingdom of the Franks. And then after Charlemagne died and his heirs were waging war against one another, they were incapable of maintaining the unity that Charlemagne had built, and so it began to crumble. And again, that Treaty of Verdun in 843, it divides up this kingdom of Charlemagne's into these three portions, and they're all weakened portions. Um, But again, the Vikings, they will gain more and more control. Long ships of the Vikings will sail up the Loire and Seine rivers, all the way to Paris, threatening the Parisians and the king of the Franks. And during the reign of Charles the Simple, what a great name, he ruled from like 898 to 922. The Normans, under the rule of or leadership of Rollo, who had come from Norway, a Viking, they settled in an area on either side of the Seine River, downstream from Paris, in what would eventually become known as Normandy. So these are the original Normans. These are Vikings, the Northmen. So this shows how weak the kings of the Franks are. They really will just control a small area around the Isle de France. And in order to gain power, we're going to see a series of French kings, French monarchs, that are going to exert their influence and authority over greater and greater portions of France to gain that power that we will see there. So, um, what we see happen is um, the power of the French kings slowly expand. Okay, and that's going to happen with Louis the Sixth, also known as Louis the Fat. All right, as the French called him, Le Gros. All right, I think that means fat. Um, and he'd gain weight later in life, as people tend to do. But anyway, during his rule, he's going to fight wars against robber barons based around the Isle de France and against the kings of England in order to establish his authority. He spent most of his 29-year reign fighting these robber barons and the Norman kings of England to expand his influence. And he's able to reinforce his power considerably, and he becomes one of the first strong kings of France since the division of the Carolingian Empire back in 843. Again, Louis was a warrior king, but by his 40s, his weight had become so great that it was difficult for him to actually lead an army in the field. But he is going to be one of the first members of the House Capet to make a lasting contribution to the centralizing institutions of royal power in France and gaining power for the monarch. So he's going to ultimately strengthen the Capetian dynasty. Moving on to Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus. That was kind of like his nickname. Not necessarily a title, but a nickname nonetheless. But Philip was known as Philip Augustus. He was the king of France by 1180 to 1223, as you can see here. Well, Philip II will be king from 1180 to 1223. That's not when he was alive, but that's when he reigned. All right, that's when he was the king. And he is going to change his title from King of the Franks to the King of France. And he's going to be like the first French monarch to be known as the King of France. He was the son of Louis VII, and he was originally nicknamed God-given because he was the first son of Louis VII. And he was born kind of late in his father's life. So it was lucky that he was born because of that principle of primogeniture. You had to have a son to pass everything on to. Well, Philip was given the nickname by Augustus by one of his chroniclers, someone who kept a chronicle of his life, for having extended the crown lands of France so remarkably. He would greatly expand the power of the French. He would greatly expand his personal territory and his wealth. Okay, that's one of his big claims to fame. And he does so by waging wars against England and against his own people in southern France, known as the Albigensians. Well, after this 12-year struggle with the Plantagenet dynasty in the Anglo-French War that will last from 1202 to 1214, Philip broke up that large Angevin empire that had been part of, the Plantagenets' power in France. But this victory would have this long-lasting impact on Western European politics. The authority of the French king became pretty much unchallenged, while the English King John is going to be forced by his barons to sign the Magna Carta and deal with that rebellion against him that had been aided by Philip. Philip actually aided those barons in their war against their own king, um, because it would weaken the power of the English monarchy, which is what Philip wanted. But Philip is ultimately going to transform France from a small feudal state into the most prosperous and powerful country in Europe. He's going to check the power of the nobles and help the towns to free themselves from a seigneurial authority or feudal authority. He's going to give privileges and liberties to the new middle class that's emerging that the French will call the bourgeoisie. It's like the middle class. And he's going to build a great wall around Paris, and he's going to reorganize the French government and bring about financial stability in his country. And he does that by expanding the bureaucracy. So what we're seeing is a small territory controlled by the French kings initially. Okay, then over time it will grow. Louis VI will play a leading role in strengthening the dynasty, helping its influence, helping its power. Philip II will expand its influence. He will expand its power. Okay, now again, he's going to do so by winning wars against England, but also against the Albigensians, who were heretics, who preached a non-traditional idea of the Catholic Church. So they were branded as heretics, so war could be waged against them, and they would lose their lands, and those lands would go basically to followers of Philip, which would ultimately expand his power and help him expand France southward. All right. Moving on to other French kings, we've got Louis the Ninth, also known as Saint Louis. He was actually canonized as a saint after his death. He was crowned at the age of 12 after the death of his father, who was Louis the Eighth, also known as Louis the Lion. But his mother, she would rule the kingdom until he was old enough to rule himself. And during his rule, he saw the annexation of several new provinces brought into France. Most importantly, Normandy. Normandy was, taken basically from the English. So that would greatly expand France's influence and power there, as well as the provinces of Maine and Provence. So Louis, he was a reformer. He developed French royal justice, in which the king is the supreme judge to whom anyone is able to appeal to seek the amendment of a judgment. He banned trials by ordeal. He tried to prevent the private wars in the country, and he introduced the presumption of innocence in, trials. So you're not automatically assumed to be guilty. You're assumed to be innocent, and you have to be proven guilty. And so to enforce the application of this whole new legal system, he created what is known as the Parliament of Paris. All right, so the Parliament of Paris, that's going to be the highest court of law in France until the French Revolution. This is like their version of the Supreme Court. All right, so Louis the Ninth, St. Louis, he develops the Parliament of Paris, which is the highest court of law in France. This would be like the equivalent of the Supreme Court. He had gotten a serious illness when he was younger, and while he was sick, he prayed for a cure. And one of the things that after he recovered from his illness, he was cured, and he's able to overcome that illness. He takes a vow to God that he will lead a crusade against Islam. And he does so. He actually takes part in the Seventh Crusade and in the Eighth Crusade, neither of which were particularly successful. But he will lead those. And on the Eighth Crusade, while in Egypt, he contracts dysentery and he'll die. But things that inspired Louis were often his Christian zeal and his devotion to the Catholic Church. He severely punished blasphemy, gambling, what's known as usury, which would be loans with interest due, as well as prostitution. He outlawed those things. He spent enormous amounts of money on relics of Christ, which we had discussed, previously about relics. He spent enormous sums of money on relics that supposedly had been in, had some type of interaction with Christ on earth. He also expanded the scope of the Inquisition, and he ordered the burning of Talmuds or Jewish religious teachings. And he's the only canonized king of France. You know, he's the only one that has been made a saint. And as a result of that, he he has a lot of things named after him. Like if you go to St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, right there on Jackson Square, it's named after Louis the Ninth. Okay, so very important figure in French history. All right, then we have so again deeply religious, participated in the Crusades, particularly the seventh. That is a V with two eyes, and then the eighth, and that's a couple eyes, and X. Yep, I believe that's right. Okay, so um, he is going to participate in those crusades. All right, that's what he's going to do. All right, that doesn't look right. I don't think that's right. That can't be right. It must be, yeah, that's it. It's three. Yeah, you got a V and three. So eighth crusade, seventh crusade, eighth crusade. Let's see, you get a 9, then a 10. You go with an 11, and it goes all the way. Um, anyway, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I was wrong. Now I'm right. 7 and 8. V, 3 eyes. Not X with 2 under eyes. This is why the Romans decided to add the 0, people. Okay? It really just makes things way easier than having to work out with Roman numerals. They're a disaster. Okay. Anyway, so King Philip IV, also known as King Philip the Fair. All right. He is going to be a very important French king. He's going to be the king of France from 1285 until his death in 1314. He's going to rely on civil servants to help him govern the kingdom rather than his barons. He's going to rely on, civil servants. He and his advisors were instrumental in changing France from a feudal country to a centralized state. I mean, that's their main purpose. They're going to make it a centralized state. They're going to unify France and bring it under the rule of Philip. It's going to fall under the rule of the monarch more than ever before. And Philip, he wanted an uncontested monarchy, compelled his vassals through war and by restricting feudal rights. He did what he could to exert his influence over his own vassals, and his ambitions made him very influential in European affairs. His goal was to place his relatives on foreign thrones, and so princes from his house will rule in Naples and in Hungary. But he begins this long advance of France eastward by taking control of various scattered fiefs. The most notable conflicts of his reign was his dispute with Edward I of England. Okay, this was the big conflict between Philip, his big adversary, I should say, was Edward I of England, and he's going to wage several wars against Edward I of England. And remember, that's why Edward has to go and establish Parliament so he can raise money to successfully fight those wars. But he waged these wars against Edward I of England, who was also his vassal and the duke of a large territory in France known as Aquitaine. And he also fought a significant war with the county of Flanders, which had gained its independence from Philip after Philip had been defeated at the Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302. But anyway, to further strengthen the monarchy, he tried to control the French clergy and entered into a conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. And this conflict led to the transfer of the papal court to the enclave of Avignon, which is known as the Avignon Papacy, which we'll talk about later, but that's going to take place in 1309. In 1306, Philip expelled the Jews from France. He took all their property and kicked them out of the country. Kicked them out. And the reason that he did this was because he needed money to successfully prosecute wars. If you're going to fight wars, you got to have money. And he needed it. And two groups had significant wealth in France: the Jews and the Knights Templar. And the reason that both of these groups had significant amount of money is because they could make loans, and charge interest on those loans. Okay, and they're basically banks. Okay, banks did not exist in the Middle Ages, other than places like Italy, and they'll really develop later on because Christians, they looked at Jesus going into the temple and knocking over the tables of the money changers and said, "You can't loan people money and charge interest." So they didn't, but people needed money. They needed to borrow money, and the places they could turn to borrow money would be non-Christians like the Jews. And then the Knights Templar had special privileges granted by the Pope, and one of the things in which they could do was to loan money. So what Philip did is he confiscated the property of the Jews and then kicked them out of the country. Then he outlawed and arrested the Knights Templar and took all their land and their wealth to make himself rich. The Knights Templar, this was an order of knights that had been established after the First Crusade when they took Jerusalem. These are the Knights of the Temple of Jerusalem. And they had become a very powerful knightly order with chapters in virtually every country, but they were based out of France, and they had a great deal of wealth in France. And Philip is going to try to take that wealth, and he ultimately does. So he was in debt to both Jews and to the Knights Templar because he had borrowed money. Well, this is one way to solve his debts and recoup some of the money that he had spent previously by taking it from others. All right. So that's kind of what goes on with Philip IV. Now, one of the major things that he did was establish the Estates General. This is the version of the French Parliament, kind of like the English Parliament, where he could go to this group of people and get new taxes created and use them to help him create new laws. Okay, so this will help with laws and granting new taxes. And it's made up of what they call the three estates. The three estates, and the three estates are the nobility, the clergy, and the commoners. Okay, so churches, that represents the clergy, towns represent the commoners, and then of course the nobility. So the Estates General is made up of three. Oh, that's not a three. Three estates. 1, 2, 3. All right. This is kind of what helps the kings of France govern to some degree, helps them raise money, increases taxation, makes them more wealthy, and allows them to prosecute wars. All right. Now, this map demonstrates how land changed hands quite often in France. These were the Isle de France, is where the king of France traditionally had territory, and over time they will exert their influence and gain more territory. So, for instance, by 1154, the French will have influence over this area. Okay, so that'll kind of be added on to the Isle de France. By 1252, they'll have gained this territory over here as well. And you can see in 1214, they gain all this territory as a result of a conflict with England. So they take this in 1214, which is, part of the reason that the barons were rebelling against King John, at the Battle of Runnymede. And over here, you can see the French royal domain in the year 1180. This was it. That was it. That's all they had. A couple little dots over here. That's it. Just the territory around Paris. Between 1180 and 1223, all this territory will kind of be brought under their control. And between 1223 and 1337, they will expand southward. Okay. Now, the English will gain control of Gascony. All right. They'll regain control of Gascony, and they will hold control of Gascony until the 100 Years' War, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, what's going on in Spain during this time? Well, Spain is under the control of the Muslims, at least in a large portion of the country. And it's going to be divided into several kingdoms. There's not a unified Spain yet. It would be more accurate for us to call this region the Iberian Peninsula rather than Spain. But anyway, the Iberian Peninsula is divided up into several kingdoms, and those kingdoms are waging war against the Muslims. And this war is basically a crusade to liberate the Iberian Peninsula from Islam. and they're going to call it the Reconquista. The Reconquista. In English, that would be the reconquest. Like those lands were Christian at one point in time, they want them to be Christian again, and so the Reconquista is what they're trying to do. And the Reconquista is going to last for almost 500 years. And some of the major Iberian kingdoms that are Christian kingdoms that are waging war against the Muslims will be the Kingdom of Leon, the Kingdom of Castile, the Kingdom of Navarre, the Kingdom of Aragon, and the Kingdom of Barcelona. And they're going to go on the offensive against the Muslims. They're going to wage war against them. And by 1236, they had been quite successful. They had recovered all of Iberia from Islam, with the exception of Granada. All right, we'll take a look at a map in a second. Take a look at that. And the three major Christian kingdoms that emerge from this are going to be Portugal, who's not even listed up here. Castile, there's Castile, and Aragon. These are the three major kingdoms that emerge. Okay. Now, Castile will be the largest of all the kingdoms. Castile will be the biggest of these kingdoms. And to help the rulers of Castile, they are going to create a representative assembly called the Cortes. This is their version of Parliament or the Estates General. Okay, it's like the Spanish version of the English Parliament. Right. All right. Yep. All right. So it's like the English version the Spanish version of Parliament. That's the Cortes. It's a representative assembly, just like Parliament has an assembly that represents the population in the form of the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and the same with the Estates General has a representative assembly. So Spain is moving in that direction like those other nations. All right. Now, Jews and Muslims are granted the right to live under their own laws in these new kingdoms that were created, like Portugal, Castile, and Aragon. The Cortes becomes the most powerful of all the representative assemblies in Europe, and it's going to aid the kings in obtaining consent of the nobility. And over time, the kings of Castile grew stronger. And ultimately, the king of Castile, well, really, the queen of Castile is going to marry the king of Aragon, and they will be united. They'll come together, and that's going to create Spain. We already got Portugal over there. So that'll create Spain by having these two countries unify. Isabella will be the queen of Castile. Ferdinand will be the king of Aragon. And once the two marry, that basically effectively creates Spain. And in 1492, those two kingdoms are going to merge. 1492, the Reconquista will be successful in taking Granada from Islam, and Christopher Columbus sails across the ocean blue, right, and discovers the New World. So 1492, really, really, really important year for Spain. And here you can see there's Leon up here, there's Aragon, Portugal, Castile. And this is the territory that's regained as time goes along. So before 914, this is all that existed as far as Christians were concerned. Then this territory will be gained by 1080. And then by 1130, they've pushed all the way down here and past Toledo. And by 1210, they've gained a little more territory. And then they make a major push. And by 1250, all this territory down here will be part of these Christian kingdoms. And then in 1492, they'll take control of Granada. And we have a unified Spain. Well, almost Spain. You got Portugal over here. All right. But that's how Spain emerges. That's how we get it. All right, so the Holy Roman Empire. Now, this is a little more complex, what's going on with the Holy Roman Empire over here. The Holy Roman Empire, as we talked during the last recorded lecture, it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, it wasn't an empire, but what was it? Well, it was a multi-ethnic group of territories in Central Europe that developed during the early Middle Ages, and it will continue to exist all the way until the year 1806. Okay, 1806. Now, what do I mean about multi-ethnic? Well, that means it has different ethnic groups living within it. You've got uh, Germans, you've got Italians living there. You've got Sicilians, who some people would just say, "Hey, those are Italians." The Swiss, and then some people would say, "Well, they're just Germans." Um, but you have various ethnic groups, like the Bohemians, for instance. All these groups are going to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's multi-ethnic. It's a multi-ethnic empire. It's not. It's not just you know one group of people. It's many groups of people. Okay. Anyway, um, and it's going to last, like I said, until 1806. Now, it's kind of emerges, okay, with Otto the First, okay, and in the year 962, you're going to have the Kingdom of Germany, which makes up the largest territory of this Holy Roman Empire. But over time, it will grow to include like the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Kingdom of Burgundy and the Kingdom of Italy and a lot of other territories. And if you'll remember going back to Charlemagne, on December 25th in the year 800, Pope Leo III had crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans, okay, reviving the title of Emperor over in the West. All right. Well, that title kind of fades away, but then in 962, when Otto the First becomes the King of Germany, he has himself crowned Emperor, okay, because he's kind of like, hey, I'm continuing what Charlemagne had done. And that's going to begin a continuous existence of this Holy Roman Empire for 8 centuries. Now, some historians refer to the coronation of Charlemagne as the origin of the empire, but others, they look at the coronation of Otto I as the beginning, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, we've got this term, Holy Roman Empire, and people aren't even using it until the 1200s. Okay, but the concept of this Holy Roman Emperor holding supreme power and that it had been inherited from the emperors of Rome, well, that's fundamental to the power of the emperor. That's his prestige. He gets his prestige by carrying on this tradition of being an emperor. All right. Well, anyway, the office of the Holy Roman Emperor is going to be traditionally elective. So it's an elected position. All right. It's an elected position. And the German prince electors, they're the highest ranking noblemen of the empire. They usually elected one of their peers as the king of the Romans. All right. And he would, later be crowned by the Pope. But that doesn't always happen. You don't always have the Pope crown the emperor, but it can happen. But the empire never achieved the extent of political unification that we see in France or in England or even Spain. Instead, it's going to be decentralized. It's going to have this very limited elective monarchy composed of hundreds of subunits like principalities, duchies, counties, free cities, and all these other domains. And the power of the emperor is limited, while the various princes and lords and bishops and cities of the empire, they owed the emperor their allegiance, but they all had privileges that gave them independence within their territories. All right, so let's just kind of see how this plays out here. All right, so the last major German monarch was Emperor Frederick II. All right, and under him, the Holy Roman Empire had a great deal of power, it had a great deal of authority. Frederick II, he would rule from the years 1212 until 1250. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He was the king of the Romans, the king of Sicily, and the king of Jerusalem. He was part of a dynasty known as the Hohenstaufen dynasty. And his reign saw the Holy Roman Empire reach its all-time territorial peak. They would gain more territory during his reign than at any other time in their history. And his political ambitions were enormous. He ruled a vast area from Sicily all the way to the north in Germany. And as he succeeded on the Crusades, he became the king of Jerusalem. All right. But he had one major enemy, and that was the Pope, because the Pope did not like being surrounded by Frederick II's authority. The Pope's on the papal lands, and so to the south of him, he has Sicily and the Kingdom of Sicily, and to the north of him, he has Germany. or the Holy Roman Empire. So he's wedged between territories controlled by Frederick, and he didn't like that a whole lot. So the popes, they would often wage or be adversaries of Frederick II. All right. Now, Frederick kind of saw himself um, as like a direct successor to the Roman emperors, like from of the past. He was emperor of the Romans, and he claimed the title King of the Romans, and he was the king of Germany, of Italy, of Burgundy. And this all kind of started when he was very young. His father died when he was only 3 years old, and he was crowned king of Sicily. Okay. And his mother basically oversaw things for him, and she was the daughter of Roger II of Sicily, the Norman who had come and basically had conquered Sicily. Anyway, his other royal title is going to be King of Jerusalem that he acquires through marriage and his success in the Sixth Crusade. Unfortunately for Frederick, his dynasty is going to collapse soon after his death. Okay, he's not going to be too happy about that. But again, his main adversary will be the popes. He's going to be excommunicated from the Catholic Church on 4 separate occasions. This is the reason he goes on crusades to try to make up for it and get forgiveness. Pope Gregory the Ninth even went so far as to say that Frederick II was the Antichrist, of all things. But that didn't let Frederick didn't get him down. He was a smart guy. He spoke 6 different languages. He loved the arts and the sciences. But again, after his death, his dynasty pretty much falls apart. Okay, and the real authority within the Holy Roman Empire is going to go to the princes of Germany and the City Republic. And this all kind of comes to a head with the Golden Bull when it's issued in the year 1356. All right, so the Golden Bull of 1356 is going to basically outline the constitution of the Holy Roman Empire. It's going to give 7 electors or 7 prince electors the power to elect the new emperor. All right, so it's going to fix the people that are going to be the electors, the people that will choose who the next emperor will be. All right, and it's named the Golden Bull because of the golden seal that it carries. All right. Now, first, the bull is going to name the 7 prince electors, and these are the people that get to choose the king. And it's titles. It's not individuals. It's the title. Whoever holds this title becomes the elector. So it's 3 archbishops. It's the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop of Cologne, and the Archbishop of a place called Trier. And it's the King of Bohemia, the Count of Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony-Wittenberg, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. So those 7 people choose who the next emperor will be. All right. Now, Charles IV, he's going to issue this Golden Bull. And by creating this Golden Bull, it means that ultimately kings are going to be weak. All right. So the Golden Bull establishes the majority vote. All right. So as long as 4 electors choose who they want to be the king, then that person will become the king. All right. And so the votes are declared indivisible. The principalities that those people govern are indivisible. Succession to them is going to be regular. That it will always be passed on as a whole. Like you can't break up the Saxony. You can't break up Brandenburg. You can't break up Bohemia. Those things are indivisible. So someone as a emperor can't break those territories up, so those people will lose their power. So the bull, it cements a number of privileges for those electors. It confirms their role within the empire, and it establishes several large independent states within the empire. All right. So by 1350, Germany is not unified. In fact, there's no hereditary monarchy. No hereditary monarchy thanks to the Golden Bull. That means that the electors, they will elect whoever they think that they can manage. They're going to choose people that are weak to rule because they don't want their authority challenged. And so since they all have independence, guess what? They can have their own legal systems. There's no common legal system in the Holy Roman Empire. If you go to Saxony, the legal system will be different than it is, say, in Bavaria. All right. Also, no common coinage. If you're buying something in Bavaria and you travel to Saxony, you might have to use different coins, even though both groups of people are Germans. All right. And there's going to be no representative assembly. There will be no parliament, no estates general, no Cortes in the Holy Roman Empire. So the Holy Roman Empire is going to be relatively divided, and Italy is going to be similar. Anyway, here you can see the Holy Roman Empire. There's the Kingdom of Sicily. This is the Holy Roman Empire. You can see the Pope is kind of wedged right between them. He wasn't happy about that. That's why he didn't like Frederick II. Here you can see, some of the territories that are controlled, like there's Saxony that we've been talking about. All right. But the electors will control different areas within the empire. 7 electors. All right. Now, Italy, Italy is also going to remain divided. There's going to be no centralized authority in Italy. City-states are going to emerge. So Milan, Florence, and Venice will be 3 of the larger cities. And these city-states are basically the main political unit of what's going on in Italy. All right. So like a city like Venice will gain control of the territory around it and create the Republic of Venice. And we'll see similar things, in Milan and in Genoa. And so there will be no unified Italy. As we see France beginning to unify and Spain beginning to unify and England unifying, not going to see that happen in Italy. It's going to remain divided with no strong, independent ruler. There we go. There's the Duchy of Milan, Republic of Venice over here, the Republic of Florence, and then there's the Papal States controlled by the Pope. So no unified authority for these Italians or these Italian states. All right. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk about the plague as it strikes Europe. Okay. Now, before we get to the plague, we've got to talk about a famine. All right. So the Great Famine of 1315 and 1317, sometimes dated from 1315 to 1322. Anyway, it was the first of a series of major crises that's going to strike Europe in the early 1300s. Most of continental Europe, all right, going from East Russia all the way to South Italy and Great Britain, are going to be affected by this famine. And this famine is going to cause millions of deaths over an extended number of years. Marks a clear end to a period of growth and prosperity that had been going on all the way since the 11th century. Okay, all the way since the 11th century, things have been going pretty well. Things have been improving. Population had been increasing, but a famine is going to strike. It's going to cause absolute devastation. Okay, and this famine is known as the Great Famine, and it starts with bad weather in the spring of 1315. There are going to be crop failures through 1316 and again in 1317, and Europe's not really going to recover from this until 1322. And it's a period marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism. Okay, think there are instances of cannibalism in Europe during this time. This crisis is going to have major consequences for the church, for the state, for European society, and it's going to lead to future calamities, kind of pave the way for things like the Black Death. And the reason that this happens is because of a period known as the Little Ice Age. This little ice age occurs, and it means that temperatures are generally going to be cooler. And because winters are longer and they're colder, you're going to have shorter growing seasons, which means you can't grow as much food. There's going to be crop failures. So you get starvation, malnutrition, and if people are weak, they can't fight off illness. So that means more disease. This famine was just absolutely devastating for Europe and the development of Europe. All right, and it also kind of sets the stage for the Black Death. All right. Now, the Black Death, it is the most devastating natural disaster in Western civilization. The most devastating natural disaster in Western civilization. It's a big deal. Big deal. All right. Huge. More people died as a result of this, percentage-wise, than any other major natural disaster in Western history. All right. And so, what is the Black Death? Well, the Black Death begins in the years 1347 and 1348 when Europe is hit with an outbreak of what we call the bubonic plague, and they refer to it as the Black Death. The Black Death. Okay. Now, what caused this disease? Well, it's called Yersinia pestis. So it's a commonly uh, carried bacteria that's carried in fleas, and then those fleas travel around on rodents. Okay, travel around on rats mostly. All right, but other rodents as well, and it originates in Central Asia, Kurdistan, Western Asia, Northern India, those types of places. And due to this little ice age, there was some climate change in Asia, and the rodents there, they began to flee the dried out grasslands, and they went to more populated areas, spreading the disease where they went. And eventually, it reaches China, where it kills enormous sums of people, as well as India. And the Silk Road still exists. So trade is taking place on the Silk Road. And it's believed that the Mongolian armies, as they were moving from Central Asia to the West, that they had come into contact with the plague and they carried it with them to some degree. All right. And so by the end of 1346, in European ports, people were hearing rumors that India had been depopulated, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia, that they were supposedly all covered with dead bodies. So we know the plague was in other parts of the world at the time as well. But anyway, the plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe via Genoese traders at the port city of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1347. And I thought I really had that written on here, but I guess I don't. Maybe I've got a map coming up. Yeah, here's Kaffa. Kaffa would be located right over here. This whole area is the Crimean Peninsula. Okay, and Kaffa is located here in the Crimea. Well, anyway, the Mongolian armies, as they swept across Asia, okay, they came from different directions, but as they swept across Asia, they waged war against the people that they encountered. And one of the groups that they encountered was the city of Kaffa, which was, had relations with the Byzantine Empire. And it's a port city. Okay, it's a port city. And so the Mongols, they surround the city and they try to starve the people out. But by being a port city, they can still trade. And one of the groups that they traded with was Genoa. Okay, so Genoa, they had trade routes all throughout this region. And so they traded all the way over here with the city of Kaffa. So these people were able to get food. Well, as the Mongolian army was laying siege to Kaffa, the plague had broken out amongst their men. And people were contracting it and they were dying. And so the leader of the Mongolian army decided to take those dead bodies and chop them up, place them in catapults, and hurl them over the walls on the people. He did this to terrorize them and hopefully spread the illness, but he didn't really know how it was spread. And so these body parts are landing all over the city of Kaffa, and people are encouraged to gather up these body parts and burn them because they carry the plague. But some of the body parts, they land in places that people don't see, like in the back of an alley or whatever. And as people are going around and collecting those body parts, we know what carries the disease, right? Fleas. And so if fleas were on those diseased individuals, they're going to leave those cold bodies and get on the warm bodies collecting them. Also, those body parts that landed in places that people can't find them, well, rats can find them and they will eat off those body parts and the fleas will jump onto them. So anyway, the plague begins to spread pretty rapidly through Kaffa. The Genoese sailors and ships that are there, they don't want to contract the plague, so they leave. All right. But before they leave, you can bet that rats had gotten aboard their cargo and aboard their ships. And so these men began to make their way back to Sicily and other parts of Italy. And this is how the plague reaches Europe. Okay. It's how it's going to get there as the result of this biological warfare that the Mongols were using against the citizens of the city of Kaffa. Anyway, let me go back a couple slides. Alrighty. So again, it originates in Asia with these Mongolian migrations. It's going to be carried by fleas, which are bitten, which had bitten and infected these black rats, and then they're going to carry this bacteria, Yersinia pestis, and it reaches Europe in October of 1347. So when it finally makes its way there. Okay, and there are really like several introductions of the Black Death into Europe. Let me go back to that map. So it's going to land in Sicily, and then these galleys will go from Sicily, and they'll make their way up to Genoa and to Pisa, and one of them gets denied entrance, and so it goes over here to Marseille. So you can see in 1347 areas where we're experiencing the plague in Italy. All right, so that happened pretty quick. And then from there, it rapidly spreads. In 1348, it's reached these areas. 1349, it's made it to here. 1350, this area. All right. By, a little after 1350, it's up here in Russia. Okay. All the way in Russia. So we see its arrival and its quick spread through Europe. Oh, I've got an eraser. Hold on. There we go. And it's quick spread through Europe, and it happened pretty rapidly. So, how does this affect Europe? How does the plague interact with Europe? Well, between 20 and 50% of the European population is going to be killed as the result of the Black Death. There were approximately 75 million people living in Europe at the time. So that's somewhere between 19 and 38 million people. Now, some people argue that the death rate was as high as 60%. So even higher than that 50% number. We aren't really sure. Because we didn't have super accurate records. But we do know that it was significant. Now, that death rate isn't the same everywhere. You may go to an area that's less populated where there's very little trade, and some villages may not even be touched by the plague. But then you have cities that are large with lots of people living close together, and the disease spreads much more rapidly. So in some cities, the death rate could be over 60%. So it varied depending on your location. Like, for instance, half of Paris's population of 100,000 people, they died as a result of the original outbreak of the Black Death. Half the population. In Italy, the population of Florence went from somewhere between 110 and 120,000 people down to 50,000 people. So that's greater than a 50% rate. At least 60% of the population in Hamburg, Germany, they died. And a similar percentage of Londoners may have died from the plague as well. Just imagine more people being dead than alive, okay? Trying to bury that many people. In Germany, we don't have super accurate figures, but before 1350, we know there were about 170,000 villages in Germany, 170,000 villages. And by the next time we get an accurate count of villages, which will be in 1450, so 100 years later, the number of villages had dropped by 40,000. All right. So 40,000 villages had disappeared in 100 years. All right. In 1348, the plague spread so rapidly that before any physicians or government authorities could really think about where it originated, a third of the people were dead. In crowded cities, it wasn't uncommon for it to be higher than 50% of the population, as I mentioned. And in other areas, the disease bypassed whole regions because they didn't have a lot of contact with the outside world. Now, the groups that were affected the most by the plague are going to be monks and priests because they're the individual, and nuns, but these are the individuals that care for victims, people who have been struck with the Black Death, and other people that are affected more severely than others, the elderly and the young. If you're under the age of 10 and you contract the plague, it's almost guaranteed death sentence. All right. So what we see happen is by 1450, well, first of all, let's mark that somewhere between 25 and 50% of the European population died. But by 1450, Europe had 1/3 of the population it had had in the 1200s. 1/3 of the population. So that's in excess of 50% of the people killed. So you think, well, if it killed half the people, then why is it down to 1/3 of the population? Well, that's because we have something known as like a reverse baby boom. Baby boom is when a lot of people have babies, and then you have a period where there's less babies because, you know, those people aren't old enough to have babies yet. But then, like 20 years later, when these people are old enough to have babies, and I'm using the word or the number 20 loosely, if you're 20 years old, that doesn't mean to have a baby. But anyway, on in the future, from 18 to 30 years later, there's another boom. Another boom. It's called like the echo of the boom, of the original boom. And that happens over and over and over. All right. But by 1450, Europe's population is down to 1/3 of what it had been in the 1200s. Life expectancy decreased from 43 years in 1300 to 24 years by 1400. That's because of the large number of children that are dying as a result. It's really pulling the lifespan average down. Again, mortality reached 50-60% in some areas. And the reason that this population is so low is because of what happens down here. So the plague comes and then it disappears. All right. Plague comes, then it disappears. So when did the plague arrive? Right? 1347, 1348. Then it shows back up again in 1361 and 1362. All right. So let's think about this for a second. Let's think all the children contract the plague and they die. All right. 1347, 1348. So families have more children. All right. Those children are like, still young. When the plague comes again, and it catches them as children and it kills them again. And then it doesn't kill the same children again. It kills new children. But you know what I mean? Children are going to be killed by the plague. And then families will have more children. More children will be born. And then the plague shows back up in 1369 and it kills those children. And it's going to happen like that every 5 or 6 years or 10 to 12 years, all the way until 1500. Okay. So this is why the population can't recover. This is why the population is going to drop so low, because you have large numbers of children dying. And when those population begins to recover, it comes back and kills the next group of children. So it kills off whole generations. All right. So this is long-lasting effects on the Europeans as far as the Black Death is concerned. Okay. This is an image from the Black Death. This is an image that we're going to see, quite often. It's an image that's referred to as the dance of death. The dance of death. It's like these skeletons are coming along, dancing with people. All right. And it's also called the dance macabre, or the dance of death. It's an allegory of how death comes for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a scholar, a doctor, a student. It doesn't matter if you're a child or a soldier, that death will come for you. And this is going to be a really common theme that we see in art during the late medieval period. Okay. Again, here's some more death. These are nobles coming out of their castle and viewing the people who have died. Death was just a very common theme amongst people in art during this time. Okay. These are flagellants. All right. These are people who wanted to suffer to make up for the sins that man have caused, and that's the reason that things are so bad. That's the reason the plague's here. It's God's punishment, and this is how they're going to save themselves from that punishment. All right, so flagellants during the Black Death, a lot of people believe God was punishing them for their sins, and so in order to get forgiveness for those sins, some young men perform what's called flagellation. It's where they would take a whip or a flail and whip themselves. All right. And they did it as a form of penance. So, in order to control the practice among non clergy members, groups were formed in which collective flagellation was organized. It's like, hey, let's form a frat of flagellants. Let's all walk around and whip ourselves. So, anyway, these flagellants are depicted here, are formed into a procession displaying the crucifix and this holy banner, while one brother flogs himself. This guy's kind of whipping himself, and this dude is whipping both of these guys. All right, and it's to try to earn God's forgiveness and make up for the sins that have occurred. And people were just looking for solutions to the problem. They didn't know what caused it. They didn't know why it spread. And this just led to a lot of uncertainty. And people were looking for a scapegoat. They were looking for someone to blame. And so we're going to see lots of persecutions during this period. So, religious fervor and fanaticism is going to bloom in the wake of the Black Death. Some Europeans are going to target Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers, blaming them for what's happening. Lepers and other individuals with like acne or psoriasis, they're singled out and killed because they're assumed, maybe they're a plague carrier. All right. And because 14th century healers, they couldn't explain the cause, Europeans were looking to other answers like, maybe a sign in the sky will tell us, like a comet flying over. Maybe that'll tell us what's going on. Or earthquakes, maybe that's another sign from God. Maybe Jews are poisoning the wells and making us all sick because the Jews aren't getting as sick as everyone else. That's because the Jews practice cleanliness. That's because they bathed and washed their hands and stuff, where most Europeans did not. Most Christian Europeans did not. Anyway, the government, had no answer or response to deal with what was going on and how this disease was spread. People just assumed it was God's, punishment. And this belief led to the idea that the cure was to win God's forgiveness. All right. And the only way to get forgiveness is by flagellating yourself, by flogging yourself, or, by punishing those who have offended God, like the Jews. So there are many attacks against Jewish communities during this period. In February of 1349, citizens of the city of Strasbourg, they murdered 2,000 Jews. In August of 1349, the Jewish communities in Mainz and Cologne, they were destroyed. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed in Europe. So we're seeing, significant issues developing as far as the plague is concerned and what is causing the plague. All right. Now I gotta wrap this up soon, even though this is being recorded. I can't go on and on and on. I know you don't want to sit here and listen to all of it. So let me move on real quick to the forms of the plague. So the plague came in a couple of different forms. It came in the form of the bubonic plague, which was the most common, most important form of the plague. It was spread by black rats infested with fleas that carried Yersinia pestis. Symptoms included things like a very high fever of 101 to 105 degrees, aching joints, swelling of the lymph nodes, severe headaches, vomiting, and dark blotches caused by bleeding beneath the skin. This would be a contemporary account of what you might see from someone who had contracted the plague. This is one person's contemporary account. This is what they said. I'll read it. And men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. Okay, that would be your lymph nodes, people. That's lymph nodes that he's talking about. All right, anyway, he also says, from the two said parts of the body, this deadly tumor soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change. Black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere. Now few and large, now minute and numerous. He says it was an infallible token of approaching death. People could expect death with this. Such also were these spots on whosoever they showed themselves. So these spots kind of would mean that you were soon going to die. Um, and that's kind of what the Black Death was all about. It would kill you. All right. In the modern world, we have antibiotics that can save you from the plague. But again, people can contract the plague today and die in the modern world. It happens every day. All right. Virtually every day. Just not here, not in the United States, generally speaking. But people can contract it and die in the United States. It's just unusual. All right, the pneumonic plague. This was another form of the plague. The bubonic was the most common form, and it's generally named because of these swelling of the lymph nodes would swell up, and they called them buboes. Buboes. That's where we get that word bubonic. And it's so pervasive in culture. The plague was such an experience that we carry this term on. So like when you're a little kid and you're out here, you're riding along on, we'll do another wheel over here. You're riding along on a little tricycle. There's some handlebars up here. Anyway, so you ride along on your tricycle and you fall off. Oh, I fell. And you scratch your knee. And your mom walks up. I don't even know what this is. That's not a tricycle on a person. Anyway, your mom walks up and says, "Oh, you got a bobo, right? You got a bobo. Bubonic. A bubo. Okay, bubos. All right. It is carried on even today. The song "Ring Around the Rosy Pocket Full of Posies, Upstairs, Downstairs, We All Fall Down." Well, the reason we're all falling down is because we're dying from the plague. All right, that's what the song's about. Anyway, another version of the plague is the pneumonic plague. This is when the infection makes it to the lungs. You start coughing up blood, and it's spread through the air from person to person. If you catch this, you're usually dead within 2 days. This can take about a week. Up here, it can take about a week. You die very quickly from this. You die so quickly that it makes it difficult for you to spread it. It's extremely contagious, but you get it, you feel so poorly, you don't travel around, so you don't spread it. And we're kind of lucky that happens, because if it would have spread much more rapidly amongst the population, then the numbers of dead from the plague would be much, much higher. So how did the plague affect everything? How did it affect everyone? Well, it's going to alter all of Europe's society and economy. It's going to bring about, for the first time, upward mobility. Okay, people are going to be able to move up in life. So that's kind of speed up the end of feudalism to some degree. All right. So, let's just say you want to be a blacksmith. Well, if all the blacksmiths in the town contract the plague and die, that's good for you. That means there are a bunch of job openings, and now you can become a blacksmith. All right. And its demand for agricultural necessities such as cereals, as it drops, prices go down. So like one of the most expensive things people would buy would be food, like wheat to make flour and then bread. But if the price goes down, all right, there's lower demand because there's less people, so the price goes down. And if the price goes down, you can buy more food. You can get more of it. Okay, prices drop means you can buy more. All right, so if you can buy more, you don't just have to get bread. You can buy other things. Okay, you can have a better diet, and that better diet makes you more healthy and more likely to resist disease. Now, with fewer available workers out there, the cost of labor goes up. Everyone wants to hire people, so you can charge more for your labor. You can charge more for your work. And rents, okay, for all those peasants, rents are going to go down because they want to attract people to come live on their land to farm it, right? So the cost of living goes down. People have more pocket money, more pocket change, and they're able to use that money to buy better food. So a labor shortage, falling prices for agricultural products means a drop in aristocratic incomes. So the nobility are going to lose out on some money. England tries to stop this by limiting the wages that people could make, but it ultimately fails. And lesser lords start to face impoverishment, while peasants' positions, they get better. They go up. They're improving every day because it costs less for them to live, and they're going to make more money and have more money, which means they can buy more food of different varieties, which means they get more vitamins, which means they're healthier overall. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop here, and then I will do another recording that covers the Mongol invasions, as well as the Turks, the Peasants' Revolts, the 100 Years' War, and then the Great Schism, followed by Dante and Chaucer. All right, so that'll be one more of these online lectures that you'll be able to peruse and check out. All right. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have. Okay.